So what was the First Heresy? And it's a tricky question, but we take a look at it in this episode of the Accessible Faith Project. Hi there, I'm John, and welcome to the Accessible Faith Project. If you're new here and looking for insights into the Bible, faith, and history in ways that engage your brain regardless of your faith stance, then please hit subscribe and that little bell icon so you can be notified anytime I upload a new video. Also, this video might raise some other questions that you might want me to address in an upcoming video. Please feel free to share those in the comments section down below. The word heresy has been around for a very long time. It's been thrown around a lot throughout history, and it has some not very nice connotations attached to it, including some rather bloody ones. Today, it is usually used in the form of parody as a catchword for religious intolerance, and at least in one case, it has helped create a dark but rather compelling science fiction universe. I'm looking at you, Warhammer 40,000. But various heresies, at least in its original context, had a critical impact on the evolution of early Christianity. Knowing these stories also gives us an insight into why things like the creeds developed and why certain works were part of the New Testament and others weren't. So what is heresy anyway? If we are going to talk about heresy, we need to define what it is in the first place, and it's not what you might think. The word has its origins in Greek, meaning to take for oneself or choice. But the Jewish historian Josephus also used the same word to describe the different sects or philosophies in Judaism, such as the Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, and Zealots. It has since come to mean a member of a religious group who holds core beliefs that are different from the established understanding of a tradition. It's important to say that someone who is not part of a given tradition cannot be a heretic from that tradition. For example, someone who identifies as an atheist and is separate from any religious tradition, by definition, cannot be a religious heretic. This definition is important because heresy does not mean different religious traditions. In fact, early Christianity existed at a time where there was an enormous variety of religious movements. It was more than Greek or Roman pantheons at play. The Roman legions had their own patron deity in Mithras, there was an official imperial state religion, and each region often had lots of local traditions. Added to this mix were a number of mystery religions that existed and floated around each other. Judaism and its offshoot of early Christianity were also in the middle of this mix, and sometimes it all got muddled and even blended together. As Christianity became increasingly separate from Judaism, it was trying to establish its own identity while moving into cultures where this kind of religious variety was already present. So while it found fertile ground, the message of and about Jesus Christ was sometimes reshaped to something that was so different than its humble origins in Galilee. What most of us don't realize is that the early church was incredibly diverse, and it had the ability to adapt itself to the cultures around it. So early Christianity struggled to understand itself as distinct from Judaism. It also found itself risking being diluted or distorted in the Hellenistic cultures where it found fertile ground. Now, there is a lot more nuance to it than that, but it is in this latter category that the first true heresies within Christianity emerged. So what was the first heresy? In his late 2nd century work, Against Heresies, the theologian Irenaeus identified several movements that claimed to be part of Christianity that were all distinct from what he considered to be the core of the faith. By the time Irenaeus wrote this, several movements or sects had taken hold, and while many of them claimed to be the true form of Christianity, they were so far off from the original message that it threatened to kill this still fledgling faith in the cradle. Keep in mind that this was all before the creeds. It was still at a time that Christianity was a tiny minority in the Roman Empire, and it was one small voice amongst so many. So when Irenaeus wrote this work, he was looking at the implication of how certain ideas within these movements distorted the theological message from the earliest Christian writers, specifically Paul and the early Gospels. While Irenaeus would identify several individuals and their movements by name, like Marcion or Valentinus, there was one pervasive movement that was present during the 1st century that was there even before Christianity became fully distinguished from Judaism. It was down to the question of, was Jesus real or not? Well, more specifically, was Jesus a flesh and blood human being with all of those qualities, or was Jesus a divine spirit who merely appeared to be human? This was an important question because Greek mythology was filled with the idea that the gods often appeared to people, taking on different, mostly human forms or disguises. Well, Zeus got rather creative with those, but you kind of get the idea. As the stories of Jesus moved into Hellenistic cultures, many adapted him into this kind of perspective because it was what they knew. They essentially understood Jesus in this way as a being of spirit who appeared on earth to teach and instill divine wisdom. In fact, there was one instance described in the Acts of the Apostles where the residents of Lyca thought that Paul and Barnabas were this kind of manifestation of Hermes and Zeus, respectively. The term that we use to describe this viewpoint, especially when it comes to Jesus, is Docetism. It would gain traction in various places as Christianity developed, but there was a major flaw that undercuts the core message of early Christians. From the Docetic point of view, Jesus only appeared to be human. Therefore, he never went through all that messy stuff like being born or having to eat or the implications of that, and of course that whole scandalous bit about the crucifixion. At best, they claimed that Jesus only appeared to suffer, but since he was a spirit, he never actually did. And that was the problem. As attractive as this was, it soon became apparent that such an outlook that Jesus was an apparition completely undercut one of the most core parts of the story of Jesus, that the Romans tortured and brutally executed him by crucifixion. By denying that Jesus experienced pain and death, it essentially negated the need for resurrection, effectively obliterating the Christian message. In that way, it erased the humanity of Jesus and with it, the hope of the release from sin and death. It denied both the historical reality of the crucifixion of Jesus and the theological hope of the resurrection. Essentially, Christ became no different than the figures of the pantheons in the Greek and Roman empires. This was so early in the development of early Christianity that echoes against it are found right in the Bible, and not just in Paul's writings. The Gospel of John, in both the prologue and epilogue, takes steps to ensure that it was clear that Jesus lived a tangible human life. When the creeds of the church were developed centuries later, they emphasized that Jesus was born of a human mother. It was much more important to say that Jesus was born more than anything else in that line. Docetism was persistent though, and it continued to be influential in Christianity's early history. Both Marcion and Valentinus, for example, both led heretical splinter groups that relied on a Docetic view of Jesus Christ in developing their own esoteric theologies within a movement broadly called Gnosticism. While they both met with a degree of success in their own right and had a significant impact on the development of Orthodox Christianity, their stories I will have to save for another video. It is important to note that as the early church was figuring itself out, there really was a diversity of views, more so than most of us realize. Some of these would be retroactively labeled as heresy by later theologians, but in their own day they weren't viewed as such. Docetism, on the other hand, despite finding fertile ground amongst early Christians, was identified at the time as being outside of the consensus because it denied the humanity of Jesus. So while there may be some arguments among scholars around the finer points, there is a reasonable case to be made that Docetism was one of the earliest, if not the first, genuine heresy within Christianity. So I hope you found this both helpful and interesting. I wanted to say a special thank you to the participants of the Reddit Academic Biblical Forum who helped in bouncing some ideas around in what is really a much more complicated topic. So if you want to explore this in ways that will expand your horizons and deepen your understanding regardless of your faith stance, then come and join us on this journey by clicking on subscribe and that little bell icon, and you're all set to go. And I'll see you next time on the Accessible Faith Project.